The nervous system, the spinal cord. The description of the CNS is concentrated on the structures of the brain, but the spinal cord is another major organ of the system. Whereas the brain develops out of expansions of the neural tube into primary and secondary vesicles, the spinal cord maintains the tube structure and is only specialized into certain regions. As the spinal cord continues to develop in the newborn, anatomical features mark its surface. The anterior midline is marked by the anterior median fissure, and the posterior midline is marked by the posterior median sulcus. The axons enter the posterior side through the dorsal posterior nerve root, which marks the posterolateral sulcus on either side. The axons emerging from the anterior side do so through the ventral anterior nerve root. Note that it is common to see the term dorsal meaning back, and ventral meaning belly, used interchangeably with posterior and anterior, particularly in reference to nerves and the structures of the spinal cord. On the whole, the posterior regions are responsible for sensory functions, and the anterior regions are associated with motor functions. This comes from the initial development of the spinal cord, which is divided into the basal plate and the alar plate. The basal plate is closest to the ventral midline of the neural tube, which will become the anterior surface of the spinal cord and gives rise to motor neurons. The alar plate is on the dorsal side of the neural tube and gives rise to neurons that will receive sensory input from the periphery. The length of the spinal cord is divided into regions that correspond to the regions of the vertebral column. The name of a spinal cord region corresponds to the level at which spinal nerves pass through the intervertebral foramina. Immediately adjacent to the brainstem is the following divisions of the spinal cord: cervical region, thoracic region, lumbar region, sacral region. The spinal cord is not the full length of the vertebral column because the spinal cord does not grow significantly longer after the first or second year, but the skeleton continues to grow. The nerves that emerge from the spinal cord pass through the intervertebral foramina at the respective levels. As the vertebral column grows, these nerves grow with it and result in a long bundle of nerves that resemble a horse's tail and is named the cauda equina. The sacral spinal cord is at the level of the upper lumbar vertebral bones. The spinal nerves extend from their various levels to the proper level of the vertebral column. Neurons. Neurons are the cells considered to be the basis of nervous tissue. They are responsible for the electrical signals that communicate information about sensations and that produce movements in response to those stimuli, along with inducing thought processes within the brain. An important part of the function of neurons is in their shape or structure. The three-dimensional shape of these cells make the immense numbers of connections within the nervous system possible. Parts of a neuron. As you learned in the first section, the main part of a neuron is the cell body, which is also known as the soma or soma body. The cell body contains the nucleus and most of the major organelles. But what makes neurons special is that they have many extensions of their cell membranes, which are generally referred to as processes. Neurons are usually described as having one and only one axon, a fiber that emerges from the cell body and projects to target cells. That single axon can branch repeatedly to communicate with many target cells. It is the axon that propagates the nerve cell, which is communicated to one or more cells. The other processes of the neuron are dendrites, which receive information from other neurons at specialized areas of contact called synapses. The dendrites are unusually highly branched processes, providing locations for other neurons to communicate within the cell body. Information flows through a neuron from the dendrites across the cell body and down the axon. This gives the neuron a polarity, meaning that information flows in this one direction. Where the axon emerges from the cell body, there is a special region referred to as the axon hillock. This is a tapering of the cell body toward the axon fiber. Within the axon hillock, the cytoplasm changes to a solution of limited components called axoplasm. Because the axon hillock representing the beginning of the axon is also referred to as the initial segment. Many axons are wrapped by an insulating substance called myelin, which is actually made from glial cells. Myelin acts as insulation, much like the plastic or rubber that is used to insulate electrical wires. A key difference between myelin and the insulation on a wire is that there are gaps in the myelin covering of an axon. Each gap is called a node of Ranvier and is important to the way that electrical signals travel down the axon. The length of the axon between each gap, which is wrapped in myelin, is referred to as an axon segment. At the end of the axon is the axon terminal, where there are usually several branches extending toward the target cell, each of which ends in an enlargement called a synaptic end bulb. These bulbs are what make the connections with the target cell at the synapse. Types of neurons. There are many neurons in the nervous system, a number in the trillions, and there are many different types of neurons. They can be classified by many different criteria. The first way to classify them is by the number of processes attached to the cell body. Using the standard model of neurons, one of these processes is the axon, and the rest are dendrites. Because information flows through the neuron from the dendrites or cell bodies toward the axon, these names are based on the neuron's polarity. Unipolar cells have only one process emerging from the cell. True unipolar cells are only found in invertebrate animals, so the unipolar cells in humans are more appropriately called pseudo-unipolar cells. Invertebrate unipolar cells do not have dendrites. Bipolar cells have two processes, which extend from each end of the cell body opposite to each other. One is the axon and one the dendrite. Bipolar cells are not very common. They are found mainly in the olfactory epithelium, where smell stimuli are sensed, and as part of the retina. Multipolar neurons are all of the neurons that are not unipolar or bipolar. They have one axon and two or more dendrites, usually many more. With the exception of the unipolar sensory ganglion cells and the two specific bipolar cells mentioned above, all other neurons are multipolar. Neurons can also be classified on the basis of where they are found, who found them, what they do, or even what chemicals they use to communicate with each other. Some neurons referred to in this section on the nervous system are named on the basis of those sorts of classifications. For example, a multipolar neuron that has a very important role to play in a part of the brain called the cerebellum is known as a Purkinje cell. It is named after the anatomist who discovered it, Purkinje.